Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS 9 and Crosscut. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And today we're talking about grizzly bears, or rather the lack thereof. Grizzly bears used to live throughout the Cascade Mountain region in Washington state, but today they've virtually disappeared from the state's borders. So where did they go? And more importantly, will they come back? If you haven't seen the video, you might take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting and relevant. And you can find the video in the show notes or on crosscut.com. But for now, bear with us. Knut, what spurred you on the journey for this particular episode of Mossback's Northwest? What was the inspiration?
Well, I've been reading stories both on Crosscut by Hannah Weinberger, who's covered grizzly bears for us, among other wild creatures. And I get press releases from various organizations. And I've been fascinated with the idea of bringing grizzly bears back to the North Cascades. And grizzly bear sightings there have been exceedingly rare in recent years. There's a photograph from, I think, 2010 that shows the profile with the characteristic hump of a grizzly bear on a distant ridge. The last bona fide in-person sighting of a grizzly there was, I think, in 1996. So we know that grizzly bears have existed there. There probably are still some there, but very few. And then the Selkirk Range, which is on the other side of the state, the border of Idaho, Washington, and Canada, there are a few grizzlies over that away. But basically, Washington is a grizzly-free zone. And, biologists have been looking at reintroducing or have reintroduced fishers and looking at other species reintroduced into the environment, ones that have been extirpated in the past. And, the grizzly bear, that seems like a big endeavor. So what is that about?
Before we talk about supposed reintroduction of grizzly bears to the North Cascades, let's talk about the history. What is the history of the grizzly bear in the North Cascades as far as we know?
Yeah, well, that was what really interested me was were grizzly bears found more widely in what is now Washington in earlier times? And part of the argument for reintroducing them to the North Cascades is, one, they're still there, but two, historically they were there. And so what is that history, and how do we know what we know about it? So that got me looking at sort of the history of the Euro-American explorers and their first encounters with grizzly bears.
Did Lewis and Clark encounter grizzlies on their adventures?
They did. Yes, they did. And in fact, they're responsible for a lot of what we think of when we think about grizzly bears. So when they were coming west, when they got to eastern Montana, they had heard from tribes that they had encountered earlier that there was a thing called a grizzly bear that was really big. And then they began to see footprints, and they could see the size of the claws. They had seen indigenous people wearing necklaces made of grizzly bear claws, and these were highly valued. So they knew that there was a darn big bear out there somewhere. And when they got to eastern Montana, they began to encounter them. And in fact, the first bear encounter, which is written about by William Clark, he and a companion came across a bear. Of course, their instinct was shoot it. They were hunting for food. They were, of course, asked by Thomas Jefferson to keep their eye out for new species. And so they shot and killed a grizzly. And it took many, musket balls to bring one down. And that was their first real look at a grizzly in terms of how it looked physically. Of course, they butchered it and ate it. And then they began to encounter other grizzly bears along the way. Now, many of these encounters were in prairie environments. You don't really think of grizzly bears today being in the prairies, but back then, because of the large buffalo herds and no very low population, the grizzlies were. And they weren't even sure in the beginning what species they were looking at, because grizzly bears came in all kinds of colors. There were brown grizzly bears, which is what we think of, but some of them often had either blonde or silver tips.
Did they name the bear the grizzly? Where did the name grizzly bear come from? And what does it mean?
Grizzly means something like a salt and pepper beard, and that was sort of the original way of describing their coloration. But it also sounds like grisly, like horrible, like a grisly murder kind of thing.
What any encounter with such a creature would result in.
Exactly. And of course, their encounters were pretty violent, both in the sense of them being afraid of the bears, them having the firepower to kill the bears, often the incentive to kill them because they wanted either to study them or eat them. Lewis and Clark loved bear fat because it hardened like lard, so it became like the grease that they did all their cooking in. So they kind of developed an appetite, but they were curious about the grizzly and how it was like the black bear and different. But when they came back from their expedition and reported about the grizzly bear, the grizzly became a kind of more grisly killer than, and the name stuck.
So did they encounter grizzlies as they continued west into Idaho and Washington?
Well, into Idaho they did, but once they got sort of the other side of the mountains down into the Columbia River country, they didn't encounter a grizzly all the way to the Pacific coast. There were no grizzlies there as far as they were concerned. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons, because historically, one, we know from archaeological evidence that many thousands of years ago there were grizzlies in the Puget Sound area. There was a fossil grizzly bones found on Whidbey Island, of all places. And there were some occasional anecdotal accounts of people coming across a large bear. But basically they were absent. And this has been a little bit of a mystery because grizzlies can exist in lots of different habitats. They can live on the prairie. They can live in the dry side of the mountains. They can live in the lush mountain meadows and forests.
And if they love salmon, what better habitat than the Columbia River basin?
And the rivers that feed it. But at the time, at least, so we're talking about the very early 19th century, there wasn't any evidence that there was a grizzly population there. Now, that may have been because the indigenous population was very large. What baffles me is they were pretty absent from the Cascades from about Mount Rainier south. Yet grizzlies were native to the Sierras in California. And they went all the way down to Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona. They lived in some fairly dry, arid environments. Why the Cascades were empty of grizzlies at that time, I don't think anybody knows.
So Oregon doesn't have any grizzlies?
They had very few. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that folks looking at reintroduction is, well, what was the history of grizzlies in the North Cascades? And are there other documents that we can look at that would tell us something about that? So researchers dug into the existing archives of the Hudson Bay Company to take one. There were more fur trading companies, but they were the big. And they looked at the records of pelts traded at various forts that bracketed the Cascades, basically. So you're talking about Fort Nez Perce, which is in was in what's now Walla Walla, Fort Nisqually, Fort Colville, forts in British Columbia. And what they found was grizzly pelts were rarely traded through these places. This is in the, first sort of 30 years of the 19th century fur trade. But there were thousands of them that were traded through Fort Colville, which is would be on the east side of the North Cascades. So there's evidence that there was a significant grizzly population within the range of some of these trading posts.
But we don't know where any of those pelts originally came from.
No.
The fact that they were traded doesn't mean origin.
That's right. They could have come from much further away, although the fact that there's so many came through Colville and so few came through the other forts suggests that maybe they were getting them from Montana, what's now British Columbia, but also the Cascade region. And we know certainly by the late 19th century that there were bears in the North Cascades. There were grizzly bears in the North Cascades.
So where do grizzly bears currently live in the Pacific Northwest, and how many? What do we know?
Well, there are very few. So the North Cascades, maybe 2 or 3 grizzlies. I mean, we're talking about a huge area, right? And there have been rarely, but have been some sightings. So that grizzly population is very small. The Selkirk Mountains on the other end of the state, the Canadian, Idaho, and Washington border, that area has some grizzlies in the Selkirk Mountains. So, they're probably totally, I don't know, maybe dozens, but not very many.
Why did grizzlies disappear? Was it human interaction, or was it something else?
Well, we certainly know why they disappeared largely from the North Cascades, because there are photographs of grizzly bear skins on the side of barns up in the Stehekin Valley. There are newspaper accounts where it says explicitly that in the North Cascades, in the Baker Range, there's a bunch of grizzly bears up there. So what you're seeing is settlers moving in. They're moving into areas that border the grizzly habitat, and they're hunting them out. They're killing them either for their pelts or their fur. They're killing them because they want to raise livestock. The settlers basically looked at the grizzlies as a threat and acted proactively to get rid of them. And so this was true throughout much of the West, was just a systematic elimination of every grizzly you came across.
And what about indigenous tribes? What is the relationship between natives and grizzlies historically, as far as you know?
First of all, we know that just taking the Salish language and its variants, there were always different words for grizzly bears and black bears. So we know that they were known, they were encountered. We know that their claws were traded. And this includes the North Coast peoples of Canada. You see grizzly bears incorporated into dance, costumes, masks, story poles. The grizzly's image is part of this, pantheon of the wild natural world that's very common. So they're talking about grizzlies. And then we know that certain people had grizzly bear as part of their diet. The Upper Skagit, for example, who would inhabit traditionally that area of the North Cascades, including west side and over into the east side of the mountains, grizzly bear is listed among the traditional foods. So on that point, we talked to Scott Schuyler of the Upper Skagit tribe about his people's relationship with the grizzly, and here's what he had to say.
Well, from a holistic approach in our people, there's 3 tribes on the Skagit, and I think we all have the same values. And the value that we have is on every creature has its place in the ecosystem. They have a right to be there, and we have an inherent obligation, a moral obligation, if you would, to ensure that these creatures are protected and sustained. At one point, people tried to drive us out of the landscape, just as the grizzly bears were driven out of their landscape. And so it's a personal thing for our people to ensure that these animals come back and are protected. They need respect, just as we needed respect. And when people don't respect their territory or the animals themselves, then we have issues, and the animals are driven off or lethally removed. And we just need to ensure that, as we move forward and animals do come back, that they're provided the adequate respect that they deserve, just as we all do. We believe these creatures are our relatives. In our history, in our belief system, we had what was called transformers, and the transformers would take the shape of animals, and they were part of a religious belief system. And so, in that aspect, they are important to us from a religious, historic standpoint, and remain important to us to this very day.
There are rumors about grizzlies maybe making a return to Washington State. What's that about? Where is this happening? Who's trying to make it happen?
Well, it's something the federal government is looking into, and a lot of organizations that are the North Cascades Institute, the National Park Conservation Council. There are many groups that are very supportive of bringing grizzlies back.
U.S. wildlife officials and the National Park Service also want to bring grizzly bears back to the North Cascades. Go Skagit reporting the agencies unveiled the first part of their plan to Skagit commissioners and will be releasing more.
They have a real impact on the ecosystems that they're part of, a positive impact. And the argument is, let's try to bring this wild area of the North Cascades, 10,000 square miles. It is virtually the only grizzly bear habitat in the lower 48 capable of sustaining a reintroduced grizzly population of some size. And the benefits to the ecosystem have to do with, making sure that deer populations don't get too big. And a lot of it has to do with their poop. The berries they eat, the plants they eat, they spread those seeds and whatnot throughout the ecosystem. So I think the idea that they can help bring the ecosystem back to a kind of natural equilibrium is one of the driving arguments. Their other arguments include they're good for tourism. People want to see grizzlies.
Well, that brings up the interaction between humans and grizzlies. Who is afraid and who is opposed to the idea of grizzly reintroduction?
Well, I think there are a lot of skeptics, and it goes back to farmers and ranchers, people who might live on the edges of grizzly bear territory. And whether it's in Wyoming or Montana, there have been grizzlies that have decided to feast on cattle. The introduction or reintroduction of wolves into the Pacific Northwest has generated controversy. The wolf populations seem to be doing pretty well. But there are, ranchers and others who are, dead set against that. So it's been very controversial. There's also the sense of public safety. There are people who argue, well, we're making the woods less safe for hikers. There's a lot of great hiking in the North Cascades. Do you really want those people now to have to fear a grizzly attack?
Is there a debate about how ferocious grizzlies really are? And could you say that the idea that grizzlies and humans cannot coexist is an irrational fear?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it depends on human behavior, not grizzly behavior, right? So I saw a film clip recently of a whole bunch of people at Yellowstone getting out of their car and running toward a grizzly bear and her cubs. They tell you time and time again, don't get out of the car, don't approach the wildlife. But you have also in parks, grizzly bears that don't come become habituated to eating human garbage or seeing humans as potential food sources, coexistence is possible. And certainly, I think a lot of it has to do with learning how to hike or camp in bear country, in terms of how to keep your food, how to, hiking with the bear bells or carrying bear spray. Although if you're having to use bear spray,
your encounter is too close.
Your encounter is too close,
right.
Yeah.
What is the good advice for someone who encounters a black bear or a grizzly bear on a trail or has an encounter?
I think they're different techniques. You can't outrun a grizzly. If it wants to get you, it's going to get you. There's actually an account in the Lewis and Clark book of a guy being followed by a grizzly, and he's convinced the grizzly wants to eat him. And so, he goes down this trail, hikes like a mile, and the grizzly's following him. And he walks into a lake to protect himself. And modern grizzly people reading that account says the bear wanted to know about you. It wasn't going to eat you because it could gallop like a horse. If it wanted to kill you, it would have taken care of you. So the other joke about it, of course, is, if you're with other people, you just need to run faster than the people you're with or the person that you're with, to escape a grizzly.
It's true that, a grizzly is not interested in you unless it feels threatened.
Yeah.
Unless it has cubs around.
Its cubs are threatened, yeah.
Or its food source is threatened or something like that. They don't want to be involved with you any more than you want to be involved with them.
Yeah, and I think, there was a series of bear attacks in the 1960s at Glacier that taught the Park Service and other people a lot about that, because these grizzlies were, some of these grizzlies were habituated to coming up to some of the chateaus or chalets, rather, and eating human garbage and food and that kind of thing. And so that's why they're so careful to make sure that they, don't let them get at your food. Don't let them get habituated. And so they want people to see grizzlies. They just don't want them interacting with them. It does remind me of one funny thing that happened when we were at Glacier. So we went into a ranger station to get some bear spray. The ranger was like, well, you guys know how to use the spray, right? And we're like, yeah, we do. Well, the ranger said, I just had to check because not long ago I sold a can of bear spray to a woman, from New York. And she and her kids were going to go hiking with the bear. I sold her the bear spray, and she left. And suddenly I heard screaming in the parking lot, and we ran out. And she had sprayed her children with the bear spray, thinking it was like bug spray, like bear repellent. And so,
just so we know, bear spray is very spicy pepper spray. It's not to be sprayed on small children.
Yeah, definitely not.
When we talk about reintroducing a species to the North Cascades, of course, I can't stop but think about the recent reintroduction of the mountain goat.
This is one of two sites for the great goat move. They're hit with a net or dart before a person called a mugger hops out of the helicopter and loads them into a sling with a blindfold. Then they're flown into the processing area, a surreal sight as the creatures dangle beneath the aircraft.
Do we know anything about how grizzly bears would be introduced? I kind of doubt they're going to be introduced in slings from giant helicopters, and the idea of finding a bear to volunteer or capturing a pair of bears.
Yeah.
Seems very complicated
Well,
to me.
Yeah, I mean, generally they're, the grizzlies would be brought in from an area that probably has a plethora of them, and
a nearby area, is that
probably I mean, British Columbia and Alaska have the most grizzly bears of anywhere on this continent anyway. And so I imagine they would probably be brought in. I understand the Canadians also are reintroducing grizzlies and are talking about it in some areas there.
Do we know how long it would take to produce a survivable population? I mean, how frequently do they breed?
Well, I think they breed infrequently. In other words, I think it's a very slow process, of raising the young and whatnot. I think they're maybe the second slowest reproducing land mammals here. The number that I saw that was intriguing to me was, it might take 50, 60 years, but potentially you could grow a population in the North Cascades, so you got 10,000 square miles up there. They could get up to maybe 200 or 250 bear population, which is more than they have in Yellowstone. So the potential for bear reintroduction is significant. We're not just talking about, 3 or 4 bears up there. We're talking potentially over a generation or two of, hundreds. And that would have a significant impact on the environment up there, probably mostly positive. As far as the relationship with humans, wolves are another important part of the ecosystem. The reintroductions have been fairly successful, but there's the management issue of not letting the wolf packs get too big, and then you have farmers and ranchers who are dead set against it because it's against their economic interest. So it's controversial, but it's working. And it shows that it can be done. And I think that's partly inspired the thoughts about reintroducing the grizzly. If we can succeed with wolves, why not grizzlies? There's the two critters that are kind of at the top of the food chain. I think it also gets to the whole sort of man versus nature thing. I mean, we're trying to kind of have it both ways, right? The settlers and explorers and the fur traders, people come into this region and they create an economy in which animals are simply a commodity or an obstruction. We extirpated the beaver. We wiped out almost entirely the sea otters. Farmers and ranchers saw wolves, coyotes, and bear as threats. And it's a whole different relationship to nature than indigenous people have had. We want to live in cities and treat the national parks as zoos. We don't want to give up anything in order to have that excitement of being able to see the wild, but we don't consider ourselves part of it.
Right. We want to go see it under our terms, but we don't see ourselves as part of this ecosystem.
Yeah, to be honest, the closest I've ever been to a grizzly was at the Woodland Park Zoo, where I happened to be there one day, and the grizzly came right up to the glass. There was some water, and it was swimming like, practically as close as you are to me now through the glass of this recording booth. And it was thrilling. It was exciting to be that close to a critter like that. And I think those people at Yellowstone National Park who jump out of their cars and try to chase a grizzly with their children, it's all part of this kind of manic kind of separation thing that we have with nature, yet trying to appreciate it in all the wrong ways.
Is there a timetable for reintroduction? Are the studies just being done?
No, they've been working on
what is the state of this process?
The state of the process, as I understand it, is, the studies and proposals are pretty much put together, and now they're collecting public input. They have to have people react to the work that they've done. And then the federal government, as far as North Cascades National Park, then the federal government will make a decision about, let's do this or no. It's gone back and forth. There have been secretaries of the Interior who weren't enthusiastic about the idea, and there have been some that have been been supportive of it. So, yeah, it's kind of in the hands of the bureaucratic process, but there are a lot of people in favor of it, and there's some strong skeptics too. So, like everything else, it'll be partly a political decision.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. The video series is now in its 8th season. A new episode airs on Seattle's PBS station KCTS 9 every Thursday night through November. This episode of the Mossback podcast was produced by Seth Halloran, and the story editors were Sarah Bernard and Sarah Menzies. Our executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch or learn more about each topic we cover. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of KCTS 9. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.